So the question we're asking is, how come an 80-year-old tank is still in service today? No tank in history has been produced in the quantities that this one has. This is the T-55, with some sources saying as many as 100,000 being built since 1946. It's a tank that has been tested in action across the globe. It boasts a 100mm main gun, 200 mils of frontal armour and a V12 diesel. But by any current metrics, the T-55 leaves a lot to be desired. And why is this one full of holes? To understand the T-55, we have to look at its ancestor, the T-34-85. Now, at first glance, it may seem that going from this vehicle to the T-55 is a massive leap in design, but in fact, it really isn't. There is a clear evolutionary process. We're just missing a link. As early as 1942, the Soviet Army wanted a replacement tank, not just an upgrade. This would materialise in the form of the T-44, an 85mm equipped medium tank capable of taking a hit from the feared German 88.
The T-44 was to have two characteristics that were firsts for Soviet tank design, but are still vital features on Russian tanks being produced in the 21st century, namely torsion bar suspension and a transverse engine, an engine mounted sideways to save space. This tank is our missing link, a brand new hull mounting the best gun of the day, the 85mm ZIS S-53.
However, by the end of the war, the Soviets were unconvinced at the capability of the 85mm on this new tank to deal with emerging threats. The replacement for the iconic 85mm was to be a 100mm. This gun, the D-10S, equipped this, the Su-100 self-propelled gun. That did allow the gun to be brought into action, but with the rather serious limitation of not being in a turret. The upgraded weapon, the D-10T, was trialled on the T-44. However, that was fraught with issues. So, they needed a new tank. Back to the drawing board? Well, no. Remarkably, all of this development was going on before the end of the Second World War.
A prototype of the new tank, derived from the T-44 but mounting the 100mm, rolled out of the Nizhny Tagil plant on January the 30th, 1945. This tank was called the T-54, and though still very much a prototype, became known as the T-54 Model 1945.
The T-54 Model 1945 looked nothing like the T-54 I'm standing on. In fact, the only similarity is the hull and the gun. So by 1946, it was clear that a lot of work would be required to get this vehicle into service.
They nearly got it right with the subsequent Model 1947, except that during testing it was shown that the turret shape was a shot trap. Further development of the Model 1949 and Model 1951 solved that problem. And finally, the Soviets ended up with something that looked like the T-55 we all know and love, except it isn't. It is still a T-54.
So, what is the difference between the two? At first glance, they may seem essentially the same tank. Even NATO combines them under one T-54-55 bracket. But the T-55 is a substantially better fighting vehicle than its predecessor. So, how do we get from the T-54 to the T-55?
Essentially, the 55 is a combination of proven technologies in Soviet tank design up to that point in time, using the T-54 as a base vehicle to mount it all on.
A few components do get improved. While the gun retains the 100mm caliber, it is a higher power version, dubbed the D-10T2S. The engine gets uprated to 580 horsepower from 520, giving the tank improved mobility. The stabilised gun from the most advanced version of the T-54 was also carried over, along with infrared night driving sights and searchlights.
A fire suppression system was adopted and a thermal smoke generating system installed. This involved directly injecting diesel onto the exhaust manifold, something seen regularly at Tankfest. The frontal ammunition racks were given wet stowage, fuel capacity was increased, and crucially, the T-55 could now mount barrels of fuel at the rear deck. Finally, the PAD system for NBC protection was fitted. This primarily overpressurizes the fighting compartment to keep radioactive dust out of the interior, and a protective lining was also developed to work alongside this.
And so, the T-55 is born, but this is only the beginning. In 1981, when T-55 manufacturing eventually ceased, the Soviets had 4 main battle tanks in production. And yes, by the 70s, they were classifying the T-55 as a main battle tank, something it was never intended to be. It was a medium tank through and through, designed to operate alongside the heavy IS series. By the late 70s and early 80s, it was clear that older tanks like the T-55 would be totally outclassed by the latest generation of NATO armour, such as Chieftain.
Its combat capability was also waning. For example, its 100mm gun had an effective range of just over 1.5 kilometres. By comparison, Chieftain crews were trained to start engaging at 3 kilometres.
To combat this and other issues, a massive upgrade programme was initiated.
There was a new fire control system called Volna, consisting of a gunner's sight, a laser rangefinder and a fire control computer. In addition, the Bastion barrel-launched anti-tank guided missile could hit targets out to 4 kilometres, if the crew had line of sight. This would outrange most NATO armour, but if fired at maximum range, an experienced tank crew on the receiving end would likely have enough time to engage the T-55 before the missile reached them, rendering the missile unguided. So nice to have, but not a complete solution. Other improvements included a spaced armour plate on the hull floor for crew survivability, and a suspended driver's seat attached to the hull roof to protect the driver from shockwave injuries. There was also extra armour in the form of passive armour arrays consisting of stacked, thin, spaced armour plates on the glacis and frontal sides of the turret, nicknamed Ilyich's eyebrows after Leonid Brezhnev, Soviet Premier. Some tanks a few years later had these eyebrows shaved off and replaced with blocks of explosive reactive armour, usually 40 on the turret front, 44 on the upper glacis, 12 on the lower, and a whopping 84 on the side skirts. It also had mobility upgrades in the form of uprated engines, first to 640 horsepower and later to 690.
It's also worth mentioning that from a training point of view, this tank is relatively easy to operate. You have a 4-man crew in its normal configuration, driver, gunner, commander and loader in a really quite cramped interior. This particular T-55 allowed trainers to observe the crew while operating this vehicle, with holes cut in the side, rear, top and the driver in the hull, through here. Remarkably, the crew would even drive this thing around, which I'm sure was particularly hairy for the driver, who had to sit next to this moving track. At the time of filming, the T-55 has seen nearly 70 years of active service. Surely that means it's got something really good going for it, right? The T-55 is still around in huge numbers. But why is this? Why has it not been scrapped like most of its contemporaries? Take the Centurion, for example, an exceptional vehicle continually upgraded throughout its life, and by the time it's fitted with this, the L705mm, it is far superior to the T-55.
But apart from the heavily modified South African variant, the Oliphant, it is not in frontline service anywhere, and there aren't large stocks of them in reserve. This is in complete contrast with the T-55, and is partly down to the Soviets' ability and willingness to keep extremely large stockpiles of war reserves. Storing military equipment is tricky, particularly in a northern European climate. Vehicles really need to be stored inside if they are to last. The Soviets, on the other hand, had no such problem. They aren't short of space, and the vast Siberian tundra has low humidity and is likely that parking up vast fleets of older vehicles is actually cheaper than scrapping them.
Another reason why these weren't all put to with an acetylene torch was the simple fact the Soviet army needed them. They were in production until 1981 and in frontline service until 1989, basically the fall of the Iron Curtain. So how many were actually produced to fulfill this need? Well, that's really not a simple question to answer. While the common number thrown around is over 100,000 units built, this does bear some investigation.
It is likely to include all vehicles based on the T-54, 55 and 62, as well as engineer and specialist versions, and the Chinese license-built variants like the Type 59. The inclusion of the T-62 variant skews things somewhat, but is undoubtedly a very large number.
Probably in excess of any other tank that has ever been built. However, an old design is an old design, and even with these upgrades, by the time the Iron Curtain fell in 1989, this tank really was obsolete for frontline use against NATO forces.
The vast stockpiles of armour accrued in the 46 years since the end of the Second World War were unimaginably big, with one Russian general saying they had 77,000 tanks on the books. These included, of course, a lot of T-55s, but in wildly varying states of readiness. According to the Conventional Forces in Europe Treaty in 1990, the USSR had 7,508 T-55s and 3,542 T-54s west of the Ural Mountains. Of the over 7,000 T-55s, 2,948 were fully combat ready, 1,985 needed servicing, 1,518 needed repairs, and 1,057 needed either rebuilding or completely scrapping.
Another reason for the ubiquity of the T-55 was that it was generously marketed throughout its lifespan. The Soviets, as well as using it themselves, were selling the tank to a large number of other states outside the Warsaw Pact, like China, where our Type 59, based on the T-54, comes from. These were either apathetic or actively hostile towards NATO, or nations where the Soviets were trying to gain influence in, usually a mixture of all three.
Inevitably, this led to a situation in which the T-55 had a much wider ranging and longer service life than if the Soviets had kept it to themselves.
So, lots were built and lots were bought. Presumably, its combat record bolsters its success too. But how good was it at doing the business? If you've been enjoying this video, please leave a like. It helps us beat the algorithm and get this video to a wider audience. Also, please subscribe, and if you can, support us on Patreon. Now, back to the T-55. Well, in all honesty, it's a bit of a mixed bag. For a tank designed, built and backed up by a major Cold War superpower, it's fair to expect great things from the T-55. But that's not always been the case. When it came into contact with Western-built tanks, it did tend to struggle.
One of the first major uses of the T-55 in a tank-on-tank combat scenario was the 1973 Yom Kippur War. Egypt, Syria and Iraq all deployed the T-55 in significant numbers, and in fighting in the Golan Heights, things did not go well for the T-55.
But what we do know is of the over 1,500 tanks lost by the Syrian and Iraqi armies, 260 were knocked out, mainly by Israeli Defense Force Centurions. They were better positioned, the crews were better trained, and they simply outgunned their opponent with the legendary L7.
The Valley of Tears, as that battleground became known, was not dissimilar to what might have been seen on the plains of Germany during the early Cold War. Centurions in well-built defensive positions being attacked by waves of Soviet T-tanks.
All in all, the T-55's performance in the Yom Kippur War, where we believe this T-54 to have been captured, was a rather damning indictment of its capabilities against contemporary armour. Where it did fare better, however, was against older vehicles or when used against soft targets.
The lengthy Iran-Iraq War of the 1980s pitted the vehicle against itself, and even though the war very quickly bogged down into trench warfare, the T-55 proved its worth, and both sides kept buying them in their hundreds. One lesson Iraq learnt the hard way was that the T-55 was extremely vulnerable to modern-shaped charge weapons.
To combat this deficiency, they created this, what we call the T-55 Enigma. It may look rather rudimentary, but it's actually rather effective. The composite armour arrays on this vehicle on the turret front and the hull sides, they certainly look homemade. They kind of are. They're actually designed, they are a standardised modification, but they're designed for production in small workshops and factories. And this one, because we can lift it up because it's the driver's hatch, we can actually see inside because coalition forces clearly hacked it open to have a look. And you've got multiple layers of different types of material in here. It's actually rather effective as well. Any single anti-tank weapon in the NATO inventory could be stopped by this armour array, apart from the Hellfire. Truth be told, not much is known about these vehicles. Even numbers are sketchy, potentially only looking at about 8 ever being made. The Gulf War in 1991 really showed the vulnerability of the T-55 to modern Western doctrine and technology. The best example of this was the fact that T-55 was the victim of the longest recorded tank-on-tank kill in history.
A Challenger 1 engaged an Iraqi T-55 at 4,700 metres. The AP-FSDS round took nearly 3 seconds to reach its target and caused a huge fireball after penetrating.
It is doubtful the Iraqi crew even knew the Challenger was there. All of this would suggest that by the mid-2020s, it would be totally futile to field the T-55 in any situation. However, in Ukraine, it is being used extensively by both sides in the largest, most destructive war in Europe since 1945. So how has this come about? The T-55 was not in use with either side when Russia launched its full-scale invasion in February 2022. However, by October of that year, the Ukrainians had been donated 28 M55Ss from Slovenia.
These are massively upgraded from the models that we've been talking about and date from the late 90s. They have firepower protection and mobility upgrades that include reactive armour, a more powerful engine, and notably the replacement of the 100mm main gun with the L7 105mm.
Ironically, the armament of its former rival, the Centurion. So amazingly, the T-55 lives on as an effective opponent on the modern battlefield in this latest incarnation. But it continues to serve in its earlier versions.
The Russian army, despite the stereotype of having unending stockpiles of weaponry, have been struggling to keep up with the astounding loss rate the Ukrainians have been able to inflict on them.
This has resulted in older and older vehicles being dragged out of those large storage depots across Russia, eventually ending up with nearly base model T-55s being used. This situation is best described by a report from RUSI in May 2023.
It is important to note that while the introduction of older tanks such as the T-62 and T-55 to the field has been mocked online, these vehicles are largely being used in the role of the fire support function offered by BMPs and other infantry fighting vehicles. They represent an increase in range, protection and kinetic effect over these IFVs, and therefore pose a serious battlefield threat when there are a limited number of anti-tank guided weapons able to reach them at their standoff range.
Quite simply, they are being used as mobile protected artillery. In theory, they can outrange many modern ATGWs. For example, the British Army quote 2.5 kilometres as its range for Javelin, but only 600 metres for NLAW. These old T-55s are not expected to engage in tank-on-tank combat, but a 100mm high explosive round will inflict significant damage on open formations and unarmoured vehicles. So, while the T-55 is certainly no Challenger 2, Leopard or Abrams, it still has a role. It provides a useful, effective, relatively cheap and most critically available addition to the Russian arsenal. The T-55 has endured partly due to its sheer numbers, availability and upgradability. Its performance on the battlefield has varied, but its basic but effective design has proven itself again and again throughout the decades. Isn't it remarkable that a vehicle conceived at the end of the Second World War is still even a consideration for armies 80 years on? Wouldn't you agree?